everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal. Today, we're going to discuss topics that are in the news this week. This is the week of October 7th, 2021. Demetrius and I picked a couple of hot topics, and we're going to explore them. Hey, good morning, D. How are you?
Pretty good. I was actually a couple days ago. I was like, oh, I don't know if we have that much to talk about, and then things seem to blow up in the last few days.
I know. I saw the 60 Minutes episode with Facebook and the kind of whistleblower and about everything that's
hmm
going on. And I think that would be probably a great place to start. Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's big news. It's important news. I think that we should talk about it.
Yeah. So, what are your initial thoughts on it? This has been a topic, to be honest with you, I have with lots of people and have talked with other researchers, things like this for the last, I don't know, 5, 10 years. I mean, this has been an ongoing thing. Um,
Yeah,
when I saw the 60 Minutes series, I remember thinking to myself, like, okay, this is a conversation that's been happening for a while now. It's just now there's actual data and reports and documents and things like that that are surfacing that allow for some more detailed analyses.
yeah, and we talked a bit about social before. We actually had a podcast a little while back.
Yeah.
If you guys haven't heard it, you should go back and listen to it. But we talked about a lot of the reasons why Facebook kind of went down this pathway, and a lot of it is based on kind of desperation in order to maintain revenue. Because if they can't maintain revenue, they can't maintain stock price, and if they can't maintain stock price, they can't hire people. So because so much of compensation in Silicon Valley is based on equity distribution, you get your stock through RSUs and other things, and then if your stock's in the toilet, then you can't hire. You're not competitive. So then you fade away a little bit. So one of the things that happened, to bring people up to speed, is that a whistleblower named Frances Haugen has revealed that Facebook has a lot of research showing that the harm that they've done, both from a political standpoint and socially, with potentially contributing to depression among teenagers. And they have internal research showing that this is likely the case. They have not, to our knowledge, done very much about it. And they also took steps to kind of tamp down any moderation of civil discourse following the election leading up to the January 6th incident at the Capitol. So Facebook responded. They had what was it? What was his title? Like a VP or a C-level executive? Did you?
Oh yeah. Are you talking about when Nick Clegg responded?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's the vice president of global affairs and communication.
Yeah, he put out a very kind of spinny PR kind of response saying that, hey, this research isn't the same thing as academic research and all these other things, but how they weren't tobacco companies. And it felt very kind of insincere. But it's one of the things that we're going to see what's going to happen. Frances Haugen went on 60 Minutes and talked about her experiences and what she learned. And she also testified in front of the Senate about what she had noticed. And I think it will be very interesting to see what comes of this. What do you think, Brian?
I think this is the beginning of a much, much larger conversation and potentially regulation. There's data, tons of it. You can go research it out there, from academic institutions to individuals to all kinds of people studying things like teen depression and anger and things like that. And they have found over and over again that this platform, and to be fair, other platforms, Twitter has this problem as well, is it incites those feelings. It makes you more and more angry or more and more depressed because it's in front of your face all the time. And it's an
Yeah.
issue. It's a real problem. And I'm going to go back to an example. So when Facebook first started, I was on it just like I'm not no longer on it, to be transparent, but I was on it just like the other 3 billion people on earth. And I got to a point where the people that I care about the most were, texting me and sending me pictures and chatting with me, and I would get together with them and that kind of stuff. And then the people that like I don't see that often, they were the ones that I mostly engaged with on there. And when I say engaged, meaning I just kind of would browse what they're posting. I rarely posted anything on Facebook. It just didn't get me like that. I wasn't as excited about it. And what started happening over time is I started noticing more and more like depressing and kind of like negative news and things like that being posted by whoever was connected with me, right? And there was obviously a lot of things going on in the world, right? And people would post these things and then you'd see it, and I realized that like every time I'd log in, I wasn't like presented with super exciting, interesting information or cool pictures of something that someone built or anything like that. It just started feeling more and more depressing to be on there. So
Yeah.
ultimately I made my own decision. I had talked to you about it as well, and you joked and said, well, maybe it's the people you're connected to, and that totally could be part of it as well. But I just started feeling like it wasn't a place for interest and excitement anymore for me. So I shut down my account. I just walked away from it. And
Yeah.
I think it was around the time that Elon Musk actually had said that they were no longer going to have a Facebook page for Tesla and stuff like that. And I just started seeing this decline where I didn't really know anyone who was engaging on there anymore that I personally hung out with on a regular basis that I really, really liked and cared about. Not that I didn't care about the people I was connected to be fair. I just don't see those people that often and didn't really engage with them. And so it didn't make sense for me anymore. And I think that a platform like that needs to have you hooked all the time. So when someone makes a comment and it irritates you, you want to go back in and defend yourself. I think it's human nature to do that. And because that occurs so much, it becomes this platform of like agitation and irritation and things like that. So, I see where this is coming from, and I wouldn't doubt that internal researchers would study this behavior, right, and
Mhm.
try to improve the platform. You know?
Yeah, and also you're still active on Instagram. I sometimes feels as though you're more active than I am. I get DMs from you that like I haven't that you probably sent like days before, but I just haven't checked Instagram in
Yeah.
that
So
time.
interesting thing about Instagram. So Instagram, I was on Instagram before Facebook purchased it, and mostly just browsing and kind of checking things
Hmm.
out. And like you and I always exchange those cat videos and stuff of like people petting baby cats and stuff. It's like super funny stuff. Is that I'm connected to the maker community. And so
Hmm.
the maker community is on Instagram. So what we do is as we build things, we'll post pictures of them, and then people will write me back and forth, ask how I built it. They'll share tips and stuff with me. And I've actually had a pretty decent experience on Instagram. But I'm also older too, right? So I'm not like
Yeah,
competing with like you on who's bodybuilding, and getting stronger and stuff. It's like we're like posting those pictures. So those two platforms, they seem very different in their approach. But I know that the
yeah.
Instagram platform is causing a lot of issues with teenagers.
Well, I also feel like Instagram is slowly turning into Facebook. Like there seems to be a lot of clashing on there now, but
Yeah.
just people clashing on with each other, calling each other names, and a lot of insults for whatever reason, and then a lot more political back and forth on Instagram. Also, it's just slowly turning into that.
Yeah, and I actually had to actively, to be fair, I had to actually actively go into Instagram, remove everything that I am not interested in, topic wise, all that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And now the feed is much more associated with the things that I like the maker community and surfing and things like that. But even yesterday, I was like looking at it and I was thinking to myself, what do I really get from this? Yeah, you stand back and ask yourself, and it's like, I get a few tips and tricks and things from friends that are the maker community, but like I can honestly reach out to them if I really wanted to. So there is that question of like, do we really need this?
Yeah, well, I feel like what you've done with Instagram is kind of what I've done with Facebook, and I still have a Facebook account, but I rarely ever use it. And then I don't think I've posted anything since the election because I was literally just trying to use it in order to get information out at that point. But I've heavily curated my Facebook experience. Like I've removed like family members. I'm like, nope, don't want to see what you're posting. And it has nothing to do with their right to post or anything, or whether really, even if I agreed with them or not. It was just does like I Marie Kondoed it. Does seeing this person's posts add to my life and make me happy? And like, nope, they don't. Even though I agree with them and I want to support them, I don't want to see their stuff. So that became a thing. And now I've joined some pet groups and some video game groups and things like that. And it's just like, nope, I'm gonna try to curate this as much as possible to only get positive stuff And people can say, like, don't you think you're setting up an echo chamber? And absolutely not. Like, you can't avoid the constant clashes that are out there. And I'm very aware what people from different walks of life are experiencing and thinking, partially because it's my job to. So
Yeah.
um,
Another
I don't
thing
think that's
too, D, that I'll point out, you mentioned something on there that really kind of hit home for me is that groups. So some of the things that we're part of, right? Whether it
hmm
be like if you have a cat, right, and you're kind of part of this group of people that are following like the local SPCA or things like that, they always make their groups on Instagram or Facebook, right? Instead of like
hmm
sourcing all that information on their website. So in a weird way, it's like you're kind of forced to stay on it because
hmm
you need that information or you want that regular information from that local group that you're connected to, but you don't necessarily really use the platform. How
yeah.
often, I'm asking you this, how often would you go in to get a piece of information and end up spending an extra 5 minutes reading all the stuff that's on there, right?
What happens is I'll get a notification that, like, oh, your brother tagged you in something, or
Oh, yeah.
your friend posted something. So I'm like, okay, I'll go see what they posted. And then I will spend like an extra, to your point, 5 minutes looking at, like, okay, well, let's see what the new cat videos are, or like, let's check out this awesome dog, or, you know, here's a funny video of a baby panda or something, right? So I'll stick
Yeah.
around for a few minutes after that, but I'm trying to also train myself to get away from looking at social media too much, get back into like Kindles and even getting away from news articles because that
Yeah.
can get depressing too. But just trying to like manage my experience a little bit more. But kind of getting back to this issue, one of the things that is really the crux of this matter is that Facebook has seemingly chosen not to do anything about these negative impacts that they're having.
Yeah.
What's kind of your take on that?
Well, I don't understand, and I strongly believe this. Like, why wouldn't they just look at it and say, "Hey, things are heading in the wrong direction. It's
hmm
it's it's negatively impacting people. We have data to address it. Let's just be on the other side of this issue. Like, let's double down on the
Yeah,
research, double down on getting academics studying our data. Let's figure out ways to help curate the experience. Let's bring everything back to maybe where it was a little bit closer when it first started or something, right? Let's start figuring out how to combat this. They have the money, they have the resources to do it. What's wrong with being on like the other side of it and saying we're going to do everything in our power in order
yeah,
to make this platform amazing? I don't understand that. A lot of companies are doing that. A lot of companies are stepping
yeah.
up and saying, "We want to put a ton of time and resources into making this an amazing platform that is healthy for everyone."
I mean, in our previous social media podcast, we talked about how they got here kind of unintentionally. They created algorithms that were designed to maximize engagement, right? So it's just we noticed that when people respond to comments, then they're staying on the platform longer. So let's try to encourage that, and then through at least what I think, and I believe you also, the one of the most effective ways to get people engaged or to keep people engaged was with conflict.
Yep.
So when conflict happened, that tended to be the thing, and because the algorithm was set up to maximize anything that increases engagement, and that increases engagement, it ended up being amplified. The issue was that when they started seeing what that happened, they did the math and decided, and I'm sure, I am, well, not sure, I am almost sure, I expect heavily that there is research within the company that tells them how much revenue they expect to lose if they made the changes to the algorithms in order
Of course.
to alleviate this.
Of course.
Uh, the other thing I'll point out, because Nick Legg brought up kind of research, and it is, as far as I know, probably the type of research that we do. I think it's important to point out that, to Nick Legg's point, this is not academic research. This is not peer-reviewed research, but these are a lot of times very experienced researchers who worked in academia. We worked in academia. We worked at NASA. We were published in peer-reviewed journal articles. We know how to do research, and we've been doing this for a long time. And the research, the type of research this is, tends to drive multi-billion dollar, if multi-million dollar, if not multi-billion dollar decisions at certain companies. But it's not universally done at every company because it depends on kind of that corporate culture of how you consume research. And it seems to me, just kind of talking to people in the Valley, and let me know if you've noticed this also, is that Facebook was a little late to the game at incorporating research into their process. relative to other tech giants. Did you feel like that was the case too?
I don't know. You know what I mean? That's a great question. I mean, I've seen tons and tons of posts for different researchers and stuff, because they have,
Yeah,
labs trying to invent things and all this stuff. It seemed like that, but I don't know
it
for
definitely feels like
sure.
they're trying to catch up now.
Yeah.
But it sounded like they were like years into it before we started seeing those posts start to go up.
Well, a good question is like, what's the motivation
Hmm.
to hire researchers and dig into everything if your growth is exponential every year, right? You know what I mean? You get to this point.
Yeah.
It's an engineering driven company, to be honest. Like the core of that company starting out is engineering and stuff. Where you see a lot of companies that are getting built right now that are almost starting from user experience, right?
Yeah.
Design, user experience, then engineering, and like it's just every decade or so, I think that process changes. Research comes in many different forms too, right? So,
Hmm.
like a lot of the work that we do, and some of the work that I think was presented is that research where you're talking to your internal users, you're surveying them, you're having them run through different scenarios and test out different design iterations and asking their opinions and their emotions and having them rate their emotions and things like that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of great, fantastic research that gets done internally, and it tells you a lot about what's going on. So I would be shocked if they didn't have 10 times more research that could be shared externally,
Hmm.
even just raw data, right? With professional researchers from universities. Stanford is right next to Menlo Park, where Facebook is at. Go over there, say, hey, academics, like, here's a ton of data, analyze it, tell us what we can do, give us ideas, let's partner together to solve this problem. I
Yeah.
don't see that happening.
No, they're not going to share their confidential data. We know how paranoid people these companies are about any of that stuff getting out, and
Yeah,
this is kind of a worst case scenario for them for this information to come out, especially right now. I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that Facebook didn't always have exponential revenue growth. There was absolutely a time period where, right after their IPO, for example, where revenue was stagnant, and it was a problem for them.
yeah,
And they turned to this approach a little bit, where they were really emphasizing, targeted marketing and these kinds of things in order to get the revenue going, and it worked. And I think they are terrified of losing that and going back to where they were.
sure, yeah. No, I mean,
Yeah.
this has been the discussion with Twitter as well, right? Like, what would happen if Twitter, removed every single person who said anything that was toxic or whatever? And people are like, I don't know, maybe it would be a much, much smaller platform, right? I think with these social platforms, this is their big worry.
Well, I don't think it's not that hard to imagine. You just think back to what it was like when a lot of us got on the platform, and it was just us connecting with our friends and having fun and sharing cool stuff.
Yeah.
And then over time, it slowly changed.
Yeah, it sure did. But what are your thoughts on how this might unfold? I mean, we're right in the middle of it this week. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Things are just kind of like really starting to amplify on, with the data being leaked, and people are reviewing it and all that kind of stuff. We're in a year from now. What are we gonna think?
I don't think anything's actually going to change, honestly. I don't think anything's going to change from a legal standpoint. I don't think we're going to see new regulation based on this. What I think is going to happen is we're going to see a continuation of what has already been happening, which is user growth in the US, especially in younger demographics, will continue to decline for both, for Facebook in particularly, and Instagram eventually also. One of the things that I will sometimes say is that the success of a product can lead to its own demise.
Hmm.
Um, and you see this with, like, there's a reason why we're not on all on AOL anymore, right? It did really well, and then it got complacent, and then competitors came in and kind of stole their thunder.
Yeah.
And I think that's the case now, where Facebook is getting a really bad brand, and that is going to lead to decline. And if it's declining in the U.S., eventually it will also decline in other countries, and it will probably hang on for quite a while in some countries, kind of like Friendster did, and then it will be something else. We'll be on to something else, and that thing will be much better for a certain period of time, and then it might also kind of descend into chaos, unfortunately.
It's hard to say. I actually think regulation will come. I don't know how much it'll help. But I do think that there will be some regulation and possibly some changes to the laws that would actually
Hmm.
make them more liable. I think when you say, "Hey, look, if certain individuals are harming other individuals or themselves, and we can prove that it's because of things that you are
Yeah,
doing or choosing not to do," I think it does make everyone kind of step up and go, "Oh, oh, okay, I need to hire 10 times as many auditors or whatever the process would be to kind of go through all the posts and the people and that kind of stuff." And I think it'll
yeah.
come, although I think it affects actually newer companies more, right? Because
Well,
they're just starting
here's my
out.
question: is like what form could regulation take? Like, what regulation would make sense in this case in order to fix the problem?
I think it has to do with liability, right? So maybe following the same process that you do with news organizations.
But is anybody going to sue for being promoted like political groups that they disagree with?
I don't know.
Or that they agree with, even like if somebody goes on and likes Donald Trump and they're being filtered to like Alex Jones fan groups, is anybody going to sue for that?
No, but I think that the families of people who have children that have committed suicide or other harmful things have
Yeah,
occurred, and they can prove that there was negligence, then something could occur from that. They keep talking about this correlation between what Facebook posts online and being kind of like represented as a news organization versus the hard regulation that you have for the actual
yeah.
quote
I
unquote
just
news.
yeah. I think if you leave it into the hands of the public to file civil lawsuits, it's very hard to prove negligence unless you have internal data about decisions that were made, what they knew, when they knew it, and that kind of information. So I just don't know that that's going to be super effective, especially unless they can find like a very wealthy backer, the way that Hulk Hogan did with the Gawker case, in order to bankroll your civil case. I don't think a
Yeah.
lot of parents are going to pony up hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, in order to try to sue Facebook over this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, what it comes down to, if you want Facebook to shrink or you want them to disappear, stop using it.
Yeah, and I think that's what's happening. I think it is. I mean, there are reports out that most recently we've seen declining user base in the U.S. And to that point, we can slightly change topics to talk about another thing that happened with Facebook. Is that they had a major outage that affected all of their services, which sounded kind of odd to me because most companies would keep their services on different infrastructure in order for them to kind of have some redundancy. One of the things I noticed when it was down was how celebratory everybody was, that Facebook, like, oh no, the tyrant is dead kind of feel to it. Did you feel like that too?
Oh man.
Or did you
So first
notice
of all,
that?
I'm not on Facebook enough, and I'm not to be honest, I'm not on Facebook at all. I mean, but I'm not on Instagram
Yeah.
enough to even care. I didn't even know that there was an outage. I have to be honest with you
Oh,
until
really?
until I saw the news report pop up on my phone. But I was listening. I want to tell
Yeah.
you this one thing. I was listening to the radio on my way back from the
Hmm.
school drop off, and you would not believe what people were saying as they were calling in. They were like, "I feel like I've gotten so much of my time back, and I didn't know what to do with myself. I took my dog for a walk. I went to the park, and I was thinking to myself, you should be doing that anyways." But
Yeah.
I don't want to be judgmental, but like it's just people feel like they were controlled.
Yeah, well, I can tell you that both Twitter and Reddit, which are some of the platforms that I will tend to use. Reddit is very easy to curate what you see just by choosing which subreddits you're a part of.
Yep.
But the tone on there was just, I think there was one thing where somebody tweeted like, post your reaction to Facebook being down, and it was just like gifs only, and there were lots of dances and celebrations and all kinds of other things going on.
Yeah,
It was
that's a sign because you and I do
yeah.
research and we study emotions and we study people and all that kind of stuff. When you see that, you're like, that's interesting. Now it could be just that subset of users for sure, but like I
Mhm.
was hearing it on the news, you're hearing it on Reddit. Like it's there's something there. There's got to be something going on when people are like cheering in the streets over Facebook being down, right? And I feel like
Yeah,
there's
it's
a
not a
lot
good sign.
there. Not a good sign. But I wanted to switch topics because there's some other interesting things that are going on. And you actually brought this one up, and I had seen this visually from a distance. So I want to talk to you about it. Was the shipping container issue, the pile up in Los Angeles? I actually saw a pile up of shipping containers in a huge line outside of San Francisco trying to get into
Oh
port.
yeah.
And I know that you kind of dug into this. So what is actually going on with this? Is this all COVID related?
Well, not necessarily. So apparently, this has kind of been building up for a while,
Uh huh.
and it's complex. There's a lot of things going on, but to one of the things to kind of indicate where we are with stuff is there's a backup in trying to get into the ports in LA, so places like Long Beach, that there are upwards of 500,000 shipping containers, the actual containers sitting on boats waiting to get into the ports in LA, and they're being redirected north to Oakland, and they're being redirected even through the Panama Canal to the other side of the country to places like Houston in order to get them offloaded. This is resulting in major shipping delays and also just impacting the capacity of the system. And it's related to a lot of things. It's related to the pandemic. We definitely saw some port closures in China because of COVID outbreaks, or and when those ports reopened, they were limited, so they weren't able to get things out like they normally would. We
Mm-hmm.
also saw a shift in demand from a variety of things into more consumer based goods, so that with people being home more and not being in the office and things like that, so that impacted the supply chain. Then there were things like the labor shortage exacerbated existing shortages amongst truckers and longshoremen.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out that truckers tend to be, middle-aged men, people who are generally over 55. As they have retired, new people haven't stepped into the job. It's another job that nobody wants to do, which means that eventually that they're probably all going to be staffed by immigrants until they are automated.
Mm-hmm.
And the same things happen with longshoremen who are trying to take things, who are unloading their cargo ships. There's been a shortage there too. So these are all things, and it's also related to kind of supply chain issues, and it's probably related also to the tariffs that were put in place by the last administration. It's really creating a huge problem, and the way I look at it, it's gonna have wide ranging effects.
Well, this is something that we were talking about actually very early on in one of our podcasts in 2020, which was this is one of the first times in history where the whole entire world kind of shut itself down, right? It was kind of
Yeah.
like, like, right? Well, when you shut everything down, it creates pileups and it creates these long issues where it's like, oh, okay, well, now the ports are open. Okay, now the boats are backed up. Now the longshoremen, are working twice as much, but they don't have as many people because people are sick with COVID, blah, 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 blah. And it just kind of unfolds like that. And I'm
Hmm.
wondering if this is directly tied, when you're doing your research, to the issue with cars, right? Because I heard the other day, like it's the best time in history to sell a used car because people
Yeah.
can't find cars anywhere. And so I started talking
Hmm.
to one of my neighbors who works for a local dealership. And I don't know him that well. So I was just kind of joking with him. I was like, hey, how's it going? You guys selling a bunch of cars or whatever? And he's like, we could barely keep anything on the lot. He looked at me. He's like, don't buy a car right now. He's like, wait 6 months or something. He said, it's so hard to find a car and
Yeah.
you're going to pay so much more for it.
Well, they're saying it could be a year or more. It could be
Yeah, I
2 or 3 years.
yeah, and so it takes time to
Yeah.
work out those kinks because we had a supply chain that was humming along before COVID, right? So this is really interesting as we start to notice this. Where I see
Hmm.
things changing is one comment that you made, which was the labor shortage affecting truckers and longshoremen. Well, this is where you're going to see automation start to slip in. I'm already hearing companies like Tesla and others that are setting up deals with some of these trucking companies to have one or two vehicles on the road, fully automated, running, very specific routes and things like that. They're testing this stuff out and they're getting ready to kind of deploy this type of technology. So,
Yeah.
This is where this stuff happens in tech. You see tech kind of take an opportunity when they see it and try to solve it through engineering.
Well, one of the things that I always use to predict where the market is going is if there is an economic pressure in order for that thing to happen. So
Yeah.
the fact that truckers have slowly been kind of reducing for decades now. This is not new per se. It's just reached new heights because of the pandemic. But apparently, it's been an issue for quite a while. And it's one of the reasons why people have been working on this for quite a while.
Yeah, and actually, about 5 years ago, I was part of a online seminar or whatever it was, a business seminar, and one of the people came in and said, asked the audience, they said, "Do you know what the number one job for young males in the United States is?" And people threw out all these different things, and they didn't know it was a truck driver. Like that's the number one job by volume,
Hmm.
and it's slowly declining because it's actually people always go, "Oh, you're just driving a truck across the country." It's brutal on your body.
Oh, it's a terrible life. It's a
It's a
terrible
hard
life.
life. I had a family member who was a trucker, and
Mhm.
he'd sleep in his car. His wife came with him on many trips. They're gone all the time. It's
Mhm.
very very challenging job.
It's dangerous too. I believe that it's more dangerous than being a police officer for sure. It's probably not as dangerous as being a lumberjack, which I believe is the most dangerous job.
Yeah.
But you're exposed to potential crime from being on the road all the time. People fall asleep on the road and get into car accidents. They get hit by other people who are not driving properly. It's a rough life,
It's also
and
very
it's
sedentary, right? So
yeah.
you're not moving, like your body just is sitting all the
Hmm.
time, right? Which is, as we know, isn't really good for you either. So it's a tough one, yeah. And I think this is where, like you said, there's a huge incentive to do it, but there's also technology that is showing promise in the area. So you might see a mix of, manual drivers or whatever you want to call it, and then automated trucks in the next 5 years.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense where you can have a smaller workforce managing more capacity. So you could have like one driver handling like a small convoy of two or three trucks. So if anything happens, then he can step in and fix anything or course correct that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I kind of want to talk about the effects here because it is, I think, a bit of a vicious cycle. You brought up the car issue,
Uh huh.
and I think that's a great example because the silicon shortage has created a shortage of chips, and the supply chain issue has exacerbated that shortage of chips. That shortage of chips reduces the amount of available vehicles, and by reducing the amount of available vehicles, then you can't stock the shipping trucks quite as much. You can't provide trucks, and it just continues on and on. And I think that's going to happen in quite a few industries. There's a lot of people pointing out how this is going to affect retail, and I think that in the short term it will, but in the long term, it can have wide-ranging effects. It can affect, data centers getting replacement parts or expanding as necessary in order to handle growth or things like that. We might see more outages of even companies that like Netflix, which you wouldn't expect to be affected by this. If they started having a difficulty getting replacement parts for their data centers, you could see computer systems, smartphones, all kinds of things being affected by this.
Yeah. And also driving up the cost of some of those things. Right? If it's hard to get chips, then you have fewer computers being produced. Pricing of those particular computers go up, and it's a whole trickle effect. I mean, if you're interested in getting into economics, especially macroeconomics, now would be the time to do it because it's probably a very interesting
Yeah,
career choice. You know what I mean? To study what is actually going to happen kind of post pandemic. And pandemic is not even over. It's actually raging in some areas, right? And
yeah,
so these effects are going to probably happen again and again and again. And we're going to have to find ways to kind of work around it. But, it's a big issue and an evolving one. And maybe it's one of those ones that in the future, you and I will do a podcast on where we can invite
yeah.
a guest and chat more closely about how it's actually directly affecting a particular business.
Yeah, I think that I think the labor shortage in particular might be something to really dig into because it's complex. And I know that there are going to be people out there who are saying that the COVID restrictions that are being in place are creating this, but you can't overlook the fact that we have probably COVID itself has probably eliminated hundreds of thousands of potential laborers within this country, and that is not something that you can just quickly replace.
Not at all. Well, hey, let's transition to our final topic of the day. A little bit of a some positive news there, maybe, which is Disney and Scarlett Johansson have come to an agreement,
Yes.
which we knew was gonna happen. D, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure this was a negotiation tactic, but it's probably the kind of thing where Disney made a decision to change something that wasn't to go down a route that wasn't covered by the existing contract, because the existing contract only specified theatrical release, and then they changed that so that it was theatrical plus streaming with a premium buy.
Mhm.
And I'm sure that they tried to work out an agreement with Scarlett Johansson, but you and I both know that working with corporate lawyers in order to get something done is not something that happens quickly.
No.
And sometimes, you have to kind of give them a little incentive in order to be like, hey, I want this resolved. So I wouldn't be surprised if this was just like, hey, if this needs to elevate in order to get you guys to really focus on this and get the deal done, then that seems like maybe what's happened here. Um,
The big question online that I've been reading about this, if you look at the comment sections and you look at some of the opinion pieces that were written, is that they're wondering, does this affect her in any way? Like, does this make other studios concerned about working with her because she stood up for herself and put herself out and said, no, this is not right. Like,
yeah,
this needs to
I,
get
I,
repaired. And
I don't think so at
I don't
all,
think so
actually.
either. Like, she's going to continue to work with Disney. And honestly, like, good for her if she wanted to stand up and say, hey, I don't think this is right. And I need to figure this out. And good for Disney to come to an agreement and say, hey, whatever they said behind closed doors and work it out. Right. Like, we don't need to have individuals and companies fighting over things like this. You could sit down and work this stuff out. You and I've seen this many times. We've worked with corporate
Yeah,
lawyers and stuff. And ultimately it comes down to, hey, you want to do this? Yeah, I want to do that. Okay, let's write it up. Like, let's
yeah.
just work it out.
And we've been in similar places where like, hey, what do we got to do to get? I mean, it's important to point out that the people who are handling the contracts and the people who are handling product and development are completely different people. They probably don't even know each other. They probably don't even know each other's names. And more than once, we've had to get on the call with people that we're actually working with for them to start leaning on legal in order to get things done.
Yeah.
And to be fair, legal is very busy, and their work takes a lot of time. But when it comes to Scarlett Johansson, number one, I have tremendous respect for Scarlett Johansson. Yes, I love the Marvel movies, but she has been active as an actor for, I believe, over 30 years. She's been around for a very long time. She has multiple Oscar nominations. Probably should have won for Marriage Story and possibly Jojo Rabbit. Also, those are both amazing movies, and she put out a fantastic performance in both. I think this kind of elevates her within the perception in the industry as someone that you should take seriously
Hmm.
and treat as someone with influence.
This felt a little bit different. This because this was a changing of times. This is where
Hmm.
people were trying to figure out the difference between theatrical release and streaming's emerging heavily. And you know, I feel like she did what she needed to do, and I'm glad she did it. And
Yeah,
ultimately, I'm glad she's back in the films as well because I think she's fantastic.
yeah, and I think there are a lot of people who took this as like, all right, well, we need to get this established because streaming and theatrical at the same time is probably going to become a more and more regular thing. So the best practices need to be established, and she stepped up and helped make those happen. I heard an interview with Jeffrey Katzenberg not too long ago where he was talking about this and what happened with HBO and Warner Brothers when they were releasing things in the theaters and streaming at the same time. And he said, it absolutely makes sense to do it for this to do this. This is what the user base wants. We should always give the users what they ultimately want. But the thing that should have happened is that you work out the compensation first and then do this. And both Warner Brothers and Disney did the opposite of that. They did it first and then tried to work out a solution afterwards. And I imagine a lot of that has to do with they have their own release schedules, and it can affect their revenue heavily and all these kinds of things in order to keep things going.
Sure.
But that's what I kind of see it as, is just growing pains that will eventually get worked out, and then the simultaneous or near simultaneous theatrical and streaming release will become fairly standard and turnkey.
Yeah, and I agree with you. This is just growing pains, and it doesn't skew my opinion of her or Disney. Like it's just something that they
Yeah,
had to work out, right? And they worked it out, and it sounds like both parties are happy with it. So
yeah.
it's over.
I believe that Scarlett Johansson has some more projects coming up with Disney.
Yeah, absolutely. Like there's no reason. Like I'm. This makes me happy because I feel like you and I running a business, we've dealt and seen a lot of things, right? And a
Yeah,
lot of times when two individuals kind of clash a little bit, then they just kind of disappear from each other's lives and they don't want to really interact with one another anymore. And there's nothing wrong with having business agreements or disagreements, working them out, and then continuing to choose to engage with one another. Like
yeah,
that's the way it should be, in my opinion. But, it doesn't always work out that way. But there's no reason why you can't say, hey, I disagree with this and I disagree with that, come to an agreement and say, okay, let's continue working together because we worked something out. Right.
yeah. And I think it's important to note that, like, the actual head of Marvel Studios, Kevin Feige, was very much on Scarlett Johansson's side in this.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, and I saw that you had some other notes in here with Hollywood news. You want to talk about that?
So it's what has happened is the heirs of some of the creators of some Marvel characters, including, I believe, Spider-Man and Thor and some others, have made a move to terminate the Marvel's ownership of those characters, and they're trying to reclaim that IP. Disney has countersued in order to keep those that IP with Disney instead of with the heirs of these creators, and it's kind of made some news. But I thought it was interesting for us to talk about because we're getting into kind of IP law and things like that, and there's a lot of conversation going on right now about IP economy that we have
So
to deal with.
what's the core of it? Like why are they doing that now?
So, well, the speculation is because these characters like Spider-Man and Doctor Strange and Thor and those characters are now worth a lot of money.
Okay.
Those the creators did this work for hire, which we do all the time, and we come up with product concepts all the time,
Mm-hmm.
many of which are widely used. And we, when we do that kind of work, we agree to give up our IP to that company, our
Yeah.
claim to that intellectual property to that company in exchange for compensation. There is a avenue within the law after a certain period of time to try to reclaim that IP. And I think that makes a lot of sense if you're talking about IP that has gone neglected.
Mm-hmm.
Like if somebody sells a script in Hollywood for a movie and they just sit on it for 15 years, then it makes a lot of sense to say, hey, if you're not going to do anything with it, I want it back so that somebody else can do something with it. And I think that makes a lot of sense economically. I think that helps to
In
move
that
things
case though, do
forward.
you have to buy it back, right?
No, I don't believe so. I think you just have to file a letter, and then a court decides whether or not that IP goes back to you or not.
So if it was never used, because like you hear this a lot where a script is written, they throw
Hmm.
it inside of a cabinet somewhere and it just sits there for a decade. Right.
Yeah,
And they never had any intention. They just wanted to basically prevent others from making that film or
yeah. They're just buying it to shelve it, and you see this in technology all the time too, where companies will buy a patent just to avoid having to compete with it. I mean, I believe there were some electric car patents that got sat on by some of the major car companies so that they didn't
Mm.
have to compete with it. But in this case, and you can tell me what you think of my take on it, I don't think it makes sense in this case because where for a couple of reasons, because the value of Thor and Spider-Man and all of these characters, Fantastic Four, I'm not sure if they're named in this incident or not, but every single one of them, if you compare their value and where they were as characters, both economically and creatively, where they were in the 60s when all of these creators were working on these characters and
Hmm.
where they are now are completely different places. And I think that the X-Men is a great example because when the X-Men came out in the 60s, it did not do well. It wasn't until Chris Claremont came on in the 70s, and he was not a creator. He did a legendary run that I think ran all the way through the 80s, where he redefined the characters and made it a success. And Marvel and Disney have continued to invest in those characters with a lot of different creators and writers and everything else in order to bring them where they are now. And then the studios got involved and also elevated those characters creatively and economically. So I don't know that it makes sense for the heirs of these creators. They're not even the creators; they're the heirs, right? So their claim was, my daddy did something,
Hmm.
or my mommy did something, and now I want the full value for it. And I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to logically make sense to me. I don't know all the details behind it, but like when I think about it and I think about kind of the work that we do and how we help companies come up with ideas and all that kind of stuff, and they pay us for that. They pay us, nicely for our time, right? And then they
Mm-hmm.
take that stuff and they go and they use it. I'm used to that model. That model makes sense to me. Also, in this particular case, like it's not like those characters are not being used anymore, right? They're
Yeah,
continuing to evolve. They're continuing to build storylines for them. They continue to invest the time and energy into it. So I don't see how it's going to play out. To be honest, I don't think that this is going
yeah,
to move into the favor of the heirs if just looking at the information that I have right now in front of me, unless
yeah.
there's something that we don't really know about.
Well, in our case, we will work on the concept and figure out, like, all right, what form does this need to take? What kind of features does it need to have? But then there are so many other people involved.
Oh yeah.
There are designers, there are marketers, there are engineers. Like it would be really dishonest for us to step up and say, "Hey, that's my idea. I should have ownership of it."
Oh yeah, I mean it takes like a team of like thousands of people to like really move a product to market or to make a film and things like that. It's not just
Hmm.
the initial creator. And nowadays I think a lot of the contracts the way they're written when people creatively sell scripts and things like that. And you're starting to see this evolve even more. Is this thing called it's like extended royalty. So basically, they'll get paid for something, and then for the rest of their
Hmm.
existence, as well as their heirs, they can get a back end on it. So a
Yeah,
small percentage continues to get funded into the company. The family's company or something like that. Like you see that happening more and more now, but I think that's an evolution of people feeling like they built something and then someone else took it and turned it into something huge and wanting a little piece of it. And honestly, like giving a little piece back to the original creator over time, not a big deal if you end up having a huge success anyways.
yeah. I imagine that might be where things end up, where there's a settlement where they'll get some kind of royalty. I think it would make sense if they just paid them what those they did a one-time payment for what those characters were worth at the time that the creators stopped working on it,
Hmm.
adjusted for inflation. So if you're looking at Spider-Man and Steve Ditko stopped working on it in, I don't know, 1968 or something, let's take what Spider-Man was worth at that time, adjust it for inflation for $2021, and just pay them. I think that would make a lot of sense. But I think if they were to take ownership of it, then that takes away from what a lot of brilliant creators like Chris Claremont, what he did on X-Men, Ed Brubaker, what he did with Winter Soldier,
Hmm.
what Frank Miller did with Daredevil and with Batman, really redefining those characters and bringing them into the modern age. That means less opportunity for them to be more fully compensated, which I think should be done. And it also is kind of like, well, what is going to happen with this IP now that someone who has maybe never worked in comics or storytelling at all now has ownership of them?
Exactly. And what that usually turns into is them turning back and trying to relicense it, right? It's
Yeah.
because you can create a new licensing agreement based on the content that you own, right? So this is interesting. I'm sure this will evolve, and we'll hear a lot about this over the next couple of weeks, and we can circle back and bring it up. But I think today was a good one. We both were like, hey, what's in the news this week? And then within 3 days, a lot happened in the news. And I like doing these episodes because we have the opportunity to both deep dive on things we're interested in and then kind of ask each other questions and stuff. And hopefully our listeners feel the same way. But thanks everyone so much for taking the time to listen to us. We really appreciate it. We'll be posting links to many of the sources that we reference on Twitter. So you can find us, follow us on Twitter at the X Podcast One. That's the X Podcast and the number one. If you like this podcast, found it interesting or informative, it helps us a great deal if you subscribe or leave a review on whatever platform you use. Thanks again, and we will see you all next week.